I used to think the worst mistake you could make in college was failing a final exam. I was wrong. The worst mistake was handing the right letter to the wrong person, because that single moment could quietly rewrite everything you thought you understood about yourself. My name is Eli Dean. I was 22 years old, a senior architecture student, and the kind of person everyone described with the same words: dependable, quiet, and impossible to say no to. That reputation sounded flattering until I realized it usually meant people remembered me only when they needed a favor. I never minded. I preferred listening over talking anyway. While everyone else competed to stand out, I found comfort in blending into the background, sketchbook in one hand, coffee in the other, watching sunlight crawl across old brick buildings that had stood longer than any of us ever would. It was a rainy Tuesday in late October when Brianna Monroe intercepted me outside the design studio. Her dark umbrella barely protected her from the wind, and she held a cream-colored envelope so carefully it almost looked fragile. Brianna was 21, one academic year behind me, and studying journalism, confident enough to debate professors in class but somehow unable to look directly at Colin Foster whenever he happened to walk by. Everyone knew who Colin was. Even if you had never spoken to him, you knew his name. Junior engineering student, captain of the rowing team, straight A's, scholarship recipient, friendly without trying too hard, handsome in the effortless way that made people assume life had always been easy for him. His softly curled brown hair was usually a little messy after practice, and he carried himself with the relaxed confidence of someone who never needed to prove anything. Yet despite all the attention he received, I had never heard anyone say he acted arrogant. Brianna took a slow breath before holding out the envelope toward me. "Please," she said. "You already study in the architecture library this afternoon. He goes there every Tuesday before rowing practice. Just leave this on his table if you see him. You do not have to say anything." I looked from the envelope to her nervous expression. "Why not give it to him yourself?" She laughed once, though it sounded more like surrender than amusement. "Because I suddenly forgot how to be brave." I smiled despite myself. "You will owe me coffee. The expensive kind," she promised immediately. I slipped the envelope into the portfolio case carrying my drawings, never imagining it would become the most important object I carried all semester. The library was unusually crowded because midterm projects were approaching. Every table was occupied, conversations stayed low, keyboards clicked endlessly, and rain tapped softly against the tall windows overlooking the courtyard. I spotted Colin near the far corner exactly where Brianna predicted he would be, surrounded by engineering textbooks and color-coded notes. Before I reached him, another architecture student asked if I could help lift a heavy presentation model onto a nearby display table. I carefully set my portfolio beside Colin's stack of books for what I believed would be only a few seconds. Helping classmates had become second nature. When I turned back, Colin had already gathered his belongings. He noticed the cream-colored envelope resting beside his notebook, glanced toward me as I approached, and our eyes met. His warm smile appeared so naturally that I hesitated for half a heartbeat too long. He gently picked up the envelope. "I was wondering when you would work up the courage," he said with a quiet laugh that carried no hint of mockery. My mind froze completely. Before I could explain that the letter belonged to someone else, another student called Colin's name from across the room. He tucked the envelope carefully into his backpack instead of opening it immediately. Then he looked back at me with surprising sincerity. "Thank you," he said. "I will read it tonight." And just like that, he walked away through the crowded library before I managed to say a single word. I stood there holding nothing except my own stunned silence while the rain continued falling outside, somehow convinced I could still fix everything tomorrow. I had no idea tomorrow had already begun rewriting the story. That evening, just after 9 o'clock, my phone vibrated with a message request from Colin through the university student directory. It contained only 5 words that made my stomach drop. "Thank you for trusting me." Sleep never came easily that night. I must have read those 5 words on my phone at least 50 times, hoping I had misunderstood them somehow. "Thank you for trusting me." There was nothing threatening about the message, nothing dramatic. Yet every word confirmed the misunderstanding had already taken root. I considered replying through the university messaging system immediately, explaining that the letter belonged to Brianna, but every version I typed sounded awkward, incomplete, or strangely impersonal. Before I found the right words, I noticed the time. It was nearly midnight. I convinced myself that a face-to-face conversation the next morning would be more respectful. That decision felt reasonable then. Looking back, it was the first of several moments when silence quietly became more complicated than honesty. The next morning, the campus looked washed clean after the rain. Students hurried between lecture halls carrying coffee cups and overloaded backpacks while the maple trees along the main walkway had begun turning shades of gold and red. I spotted Brianna outside the journalism building before my first class. She smiled hopefully the moment she saw me, but the expression disappeared as soon as she noticed my face. "Something went wrong," she said before I even spoke. I handed her my phone. She read Colin's message, covered her mouth, and stared at the screen for several seconds. "Oh no!" Those two words carried more panic than any long explanation could have. "We have to tell him," I said quietly. She nodded immediately. "I know. I will do it today. I promise." I wanted to believe her. Brianna was not dishonest. She was simply terrified of embarrassing herself in front of someone she admired. We agreed to meet Colin after lunch if neither of us had the chance earlier. That plan lasted less than 2 hours. As I stepped out of my structural design lecture, I found Colin waiting near the entrance. He looked exactly as everyone expected him to look: relaxed, neatly dressed, gym bag resting over one shoulder, greeting classmates by name with an easy smile. When he noticed me, that smile softened into something noticeably more personal. "Good morning," he said. "I was hoping I would see you." My pulse immediately quickened. "About yesterday," I began. He gently interrupted before I could finish. "Thank you again." His voice remained calm, almost grateful. "I know that could not have been easy." I opened my mouth to explain everything. At that exact moment, 3 engineering students walked past us. One of them slowed down just enough to glance between us with obvious curiosity. Another offered Colin a playful grin before continuing down the hallway. I could practically see assumptions forming without a single word being spoken. Colin seemed completely unaware of the attention. "Would you mind walking with me?" he asked. We crossed the courtyard together toward the student union. The conversation stayed comfortably ordinary. He asked about my architecture studio, complained that engineering professors seemed to schedule every project during the same week, and admitted he still could not understand why the campus coffee tasted different every single day. The ease of the conversation surprised me. There was no awkwardness, no pressure, no expectation that I perform some emotional confession. It felt like talking to someone I had somehow known much longer than 15 minutes. That realization unsettled me even more because it reminded me that every pleasant moment rested on a misunderstanding. Halfway across the courtyard, my phone vibrated. It was a message from Brianna. "I am sorry." I froze again. She had followed it with another sentence. "I could not do it. Please give me one more day." I slipped the phone back into my pocket before Colin noticed my expression. For the first time, I felt caught between protecting someone else's feelings and correcting the truth. Neither option seemed fair anymore. By early afternoon, the misunderstanding quietly escaped our conversation and found an audience of its own. A student from the rowing team waved enthusiastically at Colin while giving me an approving thumbs up that made no sense until 2 girls sitting nearby exchanged knowing smiles after watching us leave together. Rumors on a university campus did not require evidence. They only needed timing, curiosity, and enough coincidence to sound believable. By the time I returned to the architecture building, I noticed unfamiliar students looking at me with polite interest instead of complete indifference. One classmate even leaned over during studio and whispered, "Good for you." That took courage. I stared at him without understanding how he already seemed convinced of something that had never happened. When class ended, I opened the university discussion page that students unofficially used for campus gossip. My stomach tightened as I recognized our names appearing together in several new posts. Nobody claimed certainty, but everyone seemed eager to complete the story themselves. Before I could process what I was reading, another message appeared from Colin. Would you like to have dinner together after class tomorrow? I would really like to know you better. The dinner invitation remained on my phone for nearly an hour before I answered. Every instinct told me to refuse until the misunderstanding had been cleared up. Yet another part of me knew that declining without explanation would only make everything feel stranger. I finally typed a simple reply accepting the invitation, adding that I wanted to talk about something important. Colin responded almost immediately with a smiling message saying he was looking forward to it. His honesty somehow made my guilt even heavier. The next afternoon passed painfully slowly. I barely absorbed anything during my design seminar because my thoughts kept circling back to the same conversation I planned to have. I rehearsed different versions in my head. I would apologize first. Then I would explain that Brianna had written the letter, that I had simply agreed to deliver it, and that everything afterward had been an unfortunate misunderstanding. The explanation sounded straightforward every time I practiced it alone. Somehow I suspected it would become much harder once I was sitting across from him. Before leaving the architecture building, I stopped by the journalism department hoping Brianna had finally gathered enough courage to speak with Colin herself. Instead, I found her organizing camera equipment outside a classroom. The moment she saw me, she lowered her eyes. "I know," she said before I even spoke. "I still have not done it." I tried not to sound frustrated. "Brianna, this keeps getting bigger every day." She nodded slowly. "I told myself I would explain after class yesterday. Then I saw everyone looking at both of you." I froze again. She looked genuinely ashamed. "Please, just give me until tomorrow morning." I wanted to argue, but the exhaustion on her face reminded me she was struggling with her own fear just as much as I was struggling with mine. I quietly agreed, although my confidence in that decision had almost disappeared. That evening Colin chose a small family-owned Italian restaurant just a few blocks from campus. It was the kind of place students liked because the portions were generous and nobody rushed you away from the table. Soft jazz played through the speakers while rain clouds from the previous day had given way to a cool autumn sunset outside the windows. Colin arrived a few minutes early and greeted me with the same relaxed smile that had somehow become familiar despite how recently we had met. There was nothing theatrical about him. He listened carefully whenever someone spoke, thanked the waitress by name after noticing her name tag, and laughed easily without trying to become the center of attention. It was impossible to reconcile the campus image of the flawless golden boy with the person quietly asking whether I preferred soup or salad. I reminded myself several times that none of this changed what I had to do. Halfway through dinner, I took a slow breath and prepared to explain everything. Before I could begin, Colin noticed a framed black and white photograph hanging on the wall behind me. It showed the original building before it had been renovated decades earlier. He smiled. "You probably noticed that picture before I did." I admitted that I had. That single observation unexpectedly opened an entirely different conversation. We talked about architecture, historic train stations, old neighborhoods scheduled for redevelopment, and the strange satisfaction of restoring something instead of replacing it. Colin confessed that engineering had taught him how structures stood, but architecture helped him understand why people wanted to preserve them in the first place. His curiosity felt genuine rather than rehearsed. Time slipped away so naturally that neither of us noticed we had been talking for more than 2 hours. As we walked back toward campus beneath rows of glowing streetlights, Colin asked whether I had always wanted to study architecture. I told him about spending summers with my grandfather sketching old barns across rural Pennsylvania and how those afternoons had quietly shaped my future long before I understood it. Instead of interrupting, Colin listened with complete attention. When I finished, he smiled softly. "Most people spend conversations waiting for their turn to speak. You actually listen first." His words caught me off guard because I had always assumed disappearing into the background made me forgettable. Somehow he had noticed exactly the thing I rarely believed anyone valued. That realization unsettled me more than any rumor circulating across campus. If he appreciated the real version of me, then every minute I delayed the truth became increasingly unfair. We stopped outside the entrance to my residence hall. I opened my mouth once again, determined not to postpone the conversation any longer. At that exact moment, Colin quietly spoke first. "Can I tell you something before you say whatever has been on your mind all evening?" I nodded. He looked down for just a second before meeting my eyes again with surprising sincerity. "I have been looking forward to seeing you all day." My carefully prepared explanation disappeared from my mind, replaced by complete silence, because for the first time since this misunderstanding began, I realized the truth might hurt far more than I had ever expected. For several long seconds, neither of us said anything. Colin's words settled quietly between us, not as a dramatic confession, but as a simple truth he had spoken without hesitation. I forced myself to smile, thanked him for dinner, and somehow managed to wish him a good night before walking into my residence hall. The moment the door closed behind me, every opportunity one had wasted replayed in my mind. I had promised myself I would explain everything that evening, yet I had allowed another conversation, another shared laugh, and another genuine moment to push the truth further away. The guilt no longer came from protecting Brianna. It came from realizing Colin had begun trusting someone who had unintentionally allowed a false first impression to remain uncorrected. The following week arrived with the relentless pace that always accompanied midterm season. Long hours in the architecture studio blurred into evenings filled with drafting models and presentations. Somehow, despite both of us having demanding schedules, Colin continued finding small opportunities to cross paths with me. Sometimes he appeared outside the campus cafe carrying 2 coffees because he happened to remember which roast I preferred after hearing me mention it only once. Other times he waited outside the library after rowing practice simply to walk across campus together before heading in different directions. None of those moments felt forced. They happened naturally, almost quietly, and that made them increasingly difficult to dismiss as consequences of a misunderstanding alone. Halfway through the week, our university announced an interdisciplinary sustainability competition pairing architecture seniors with engineering students. Faculty members created the teams based on academic performance and complementary skills rather than personal requests. When the assignment list appeared outside the department office, students crowded around the bulletin board. My name stood directly beside Colin Foster's. For a brief moment, neither of us spoke. Colin turned toward me with genuine excitement lighting his face. "Looks like we finally get to build something together." His enthusiasm felt completely sincere. Mine was mixed with excitement and an uncomfortable awareness that fate seemed determined to keep placing us side by side. Over the next several afternoons, we met in the engineering lab, surrounded by scale models recycled, materials, and oversized blueprints spread across long work tables. Working together revealed a version of Colin that almost nobody else seemed to notice. He was not driven by perfection because he wanted praise. He simply believed every project deserved his full effort. When one of our classmates accidentally damaged part of a prototype after tripping over an extension cord, Colin immediately reassured him that mistakes happened and calmly helped rebuild the section instead of assigning blame. Watching him quietly encourage someone who clearly expected criticism made me reconsider every assumption I had unknowingly accepted simply because everyone called him the golden boy. Behind that reputation stood someone remarkably patient, thoughtful, and surprisingly humble. Later that evening, while organizing materials after everyone else had left, I noticed Colin staring silently through the laboratory window toward the empty athletic field. His expression looked distant in a way I had never seen before. "Everything all right?" I asked. He smiled automatically, but the smile faded almost immediately. "Most days," he admitted softly, "people congratulate me before they ask how I am doing. It sounds nice until you realize they usually only know the version of you that keeps winning things." His honesty caught me completely off guard. "Do you ever get tired of everyone expecting you to have everything figured out?" I asked. He let out a quiet laugh. "Almost every day. For the first time since we met, I saw exhaustion behind the confidence everyone admired. Scholarships, leadership roles, athletic commitments, internships, academic expectations, and constant visibility had slowly built a version of Colin that everyone appreciated but very few truly understood." That evening, our conversation lasted long after we had packed away the project materials. We spoke about families, childhood dreams, disappointing ourselves more often than disappointing others, and how success sometimes became another kind of pressure instead of freedom. The more he trusted me with those quiet thoughts, the more impossible it became to ignore the truth I still had not told him. Across campus, Brianna had finally reached the same conclusion. She sent me a message saying she had asked Colin if they could meet privately the following afternoon because she needed to explain something important. Relief washed over me so suddenly that I nearly laughed aloud. At last the misunderstanding would end, and perhaps whatever friendship Colin and I had begun building could survive because it would finally stand on honesty instead of confusion. The next afternoon I waited anxiously for Brianna's update, checking my phone between classes far more often than I cared to admit. Nearly 2 hours passed before her message finally appeared. Contained only one sentence. I never got the chance. He had to leave for rowing practice, but before he went, he asked me to tell you that he hoped you would come to the University Awards banquet with him tomorrow night. The University Awards banquet arrived on a crisp Friday evening, bringing together scholarship recipients, faculty members, student leaders, and their invited guests inside the historic alumni hall overlooking the campus lawn. I stood outside the entrance for nearly a full minute before walking in, wondering whether accepting Colin's invitation had been another mistake I would soon regret. The rumors had quieted during the week, but they had never disappeared. I could already feel curious glances following us whenever we crossed campus together. Colin greeted me near the registration table wearing a navy blazer instead of his usual sweatshirt, somehow looking polished without appearing as though he had spent hours trying to impress anyone. "I am glad you came," he said with the same easy smile that had become strangely familiar. We found our seats among students from different departments, and for a while everything felt pleasantly ordinary. Professors gave speeches about leadership, perseverance, and community service while awards were presented one after another. Colin applauded every recipient with genuine enthusiasm, even students from rival academic programs. Watching him celebrate everyone else's success reminded me again why so many people admired him. Halfway through dinner, I excused myself to refill my water glass. As I crossed the room, I overheard 2 students speaking quietly near one of the display tables. "That is him," one whispered. "The architecture guy." The other glanced toward Colin before smiling knowingly. I heard they have been seeing each other. I kept walking without reacting, but every word settled heavily in my chest. The misunderstanding had grown beyond a simple rumor. People were now inventing an entire story around 2 lives that had never been given the chance to explain themselves. When I returned to the table, Colin immediately noticed my expression. "Everything all right?" he asked. I nodded automatically, unwilling to darken the evening with another unfinished explanation. Instead, we returned our attention to the stage, where the dean announced a short intermission before the final recognition ceremony. During the break, Brianna arrived wearing a simple dark green dress, carrying herself with the determined expression I had been hoping to see all week. She caught my eye across the room and gave me a small nod. I understood immediately. She was finally ready to tell Colin the truth. Relief washed over me so suddenly that I almost smiled. This would finally end. While Colin stepped away to congratulate one of his engineering professors, Brianna quietly moved in the same direction. I deliberately remained where I was, believing the conversation belonged to them alone. Several minutes passed, then 10. Colin never returned immediately, and neither did Brianna. Curious, I walked toward the hallway leading to the faculty reception lounge. Before I reached the corner, I heard Colin's voice from inside a partially open conference room. I had no intention of listening, but his words stopped me in place. He was speaking with Professor Chambers, the faculty advisor for the Engineering Honor Society. "You seem happier lately," the professor said with a gentle laugh. Colin answered after a brief pause. "I think I finally met someone who sees me without caring about the awards, the rowing team, or everything people expect me to be." The professor smiled. "That can be rare." Colin nodded thoughtfully. "I do not really care how everything started anymore. I only know that meeting Eli changed this entire semester for me." My heart sank. Every ounce of determination I had built over the past week collapsed beneath the weight of those simple words. Before I could move away unnoticed, I spotted Brianna standing several feet farther down the hallway. She had clearly heard the conversation too. Our eyes met for only a moment. Tears did not fill her eyes, nor did she appear jealous. Instead, she looked overwhelmed by the realization that revealing the truth now might hurt someone who had done nothing wrong. She slowly lowered her gaze, turned around without interrupting the conversation, and quietly walked back toward the banquet hall. I wanted to follow her, but I remained frozen where I stood, unable to decide whether honesty still represented kindness or whether waiting one more night might spare unnecessary pain. By the time the ceremony ended, Colin found me outside beneath strings of warm lights decorating the courtyard. He thanked me again for coming and wished me good night before leaving with several teammates who had offered him a ride back to campus housing. I watched him disappear into the parking lot, feeling more conflicted than ever before. Later that night, unable to sleep, I opened my laptop intending to distract myself by reviewing our sustainability project. Instead, I noticed that Brianna had accidentally shared one of her journalism folders with me earlier that week while we exchanged research files. Inside was a document titled Original Letter. My hand hesitated above the trackpad as I realized I was staring at the confession she had written but Colin had never actually read. For several minutes, I simply stared at the file without opening it. It felt wrong to read words that had never been meant for me, even if I had stumbled across them by accident. I closed the folder immediately, shut my laptop, and sat quietly beside my dorm room window while the lights from the library reflected across the wet sidewalks below. The problem had never been the contents of Brianna's letter. The problem was that I had allowed an honest mistake to survive long enough to become part of someone else's reality. No matter how painful the conversation might become, I knew I could not postpone it another day. Early Saturday morning, I sent Colin a short message asking if we could meet somewhere quiet before we continued working on our sustainability project. His reply arrived only a few minutes later. Of course, same place by the architecture courtyard? The familiar warmth in his response only strengthened my resolve. When I arrived, the campus felt unusually peaceful. Most students were still sleeping after the previous night's banquet, leaving the brick pathways almost empty except for a few joggers and groundskeepers preparing flower beds for the weekend visitors. Colin was already waiting near the fountain with 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to me without saying anything, noticing almost immediately that something weighed heavily on my mind. "You wanted to tell me something," he said gently. "You have been trying to say it for days." I nodded slowly. "I should have said it the first night we met." He remained completely silent, giving me room to speak instead of trying to guess what was coming. I took a long breath and finally told him everything from the beginning. I explained how Brianna had written the letter after quietly admiring him for months. I described her asking me to deliver it because she lost her nerve at the last minute. I admitted leaving the envelope beside his books while helping another student, then watching him mistakenly believe it belonged to me before I froze and failed to correct him. I confessed every opportunity one had wasted afterward, every conversation I intended to have, every moment I convinced myself I would explain tomorrow instead of today. Nothing about my explanation sounded dramatic once it was finally spoken aloud. It was simply the truth, delayed far too long. Colin listened without interrupting a single time. His expression never hardened. He never looked angry. He simply watched me with quiet attention until I finished speaking. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, yet it felt much longer. Then he asked one calm question that immediately revealed what mattered most to him. "So none of those words in the letter were yours?" I lowered my eyes and answered honestly, "No, they never were." He looked down at the coffee cup in his hands before giving a small, thoughtful nod. "Thank you for finally telling me." His voice remained kind, but something subtle had changed. The easy warmth that had always filled our conversations seemed replaced by careful distance. We stood there together without speaking again. I wanted to apologize once more, but every apology now felt smaller than the trust one had unintentionally damaged. After another quiet moment, Colin set his untouched coffee on the edge of the fountain. "I think I need a little time," he said softly. There was no accusation in his voice, No disappointment expressed through anger. Somehow that gentleness hurt even more. I nodded because I understood he deserved the space I had never given the truth. He offered me one final polite smile before turning toward the engineering building and walking away alone. I remained beside the fountain long after he disappeared from view, wondering whether honesty had arrived too late to save what had quietly grown between us. As I finally started back toward my dormitory, I heard a familiar voice behind me. I turned to see Brianna standing several yards away, her eyes filled not with surprise but with quiet understanding. She had arrived in time to hear the final part of my confession, and the expression on her face told me she understood that the misunderstanding had finally ended, even though its consequences had only just begun. The campus seemed strangely quieter after that Saturday morning, although I knew nothing around me had actually changed. Students still hurried across the sidewalks balancing coffee cups and backpacks. Professors still filled lecture halls with deadlines and assignments, and autumn leaves continued drifting across the courtyard outside the architecture building. The only thing that had truly changed was the empty space where Colin's daily messages and unexpected conversations had once existed. He did exactly what he had asked for. He gave himself time. During the following week, we crossed paths several times because our sustainability competition still required both of us to attend scheduled team meetings. Every interaction remained polite, respectful, and professional. We discussed structural calculations, environmental materials, presentation deadlines, and design revisions with complete efficiency. Yet the easy laughter that had once filled those conversations had quietly disappeared. When meetings ended, Colin simply wished everyone a good afternoon before leaving with his notebooks tucked beneath one arm. He never ignored me, but he no longer searched for reasons to walk across campus together either. That distance hurt more than I expected because it revealed something I had refused to admit to myself until it was already slipping away. One afternoon I found myself standing outside the engineering building after our project meeting had finished, watching Colin disappear into the student recreation center for rowing practice. I realized I was not hoping for another misunderstanding to bring him back. I simply missed talking to him. That realization settled heavily inside me because it had nothing to do with rumors anymore. Somewhere between library conversations, shared coffees, late evenings working on blueprints, and quiet walks across campus, he had become someone whose company I genuinely valued. The friendship I thought had been built on a mistake had somehow become completely real. Later that evening, Brianna asked if we could meet at the campus bookstore cafe. She looked more relieved than I had seen her in weeks, although traces of guilt still lingered behind her smile. "I finally told people the truth," she said before I even sat down. She explained that she had posted a short message on the university discussion page, taking full responsibility for the misunderstanding without identifying anyone beyond the details already circulating publicly. She never mentioned private details, never embarrassed Colin, and never shifted blame toward anyone else. She simply admitted that the original letter had belonged to her, that I had agreed to deliver it as a favor, and that the confusion had grown because fear kept her silent for too long. "Some people apologized," she said quietly. "Some people probably never will, but at least nobody has to keep guessing anymore." I thanked her sincerely. Although the rumors had not disappeared overnight, the endless speculation slowly began fading as students found newer topics to discuss. For the first time in weeks, I could walk across campus without noticing curious whispers following behind me. I thought that would bring relief. Instead, I discovered that the silence left behind made Colin's absence feel even louder. A few days later, our sustainability team gathered for another faculty review. Something immediately caught everyone's attention. Colin announced that he was stepping down as captain of the rowing team after the season ended. He also declined a nomination for next semester's engineering student council. The room fell unusually quiet. Several classmates looked genuinely shocked. Nobody understood why someone with such an impressive record would voluntarily give up leadership positions he had earned. Professor Chambers asked whether everything was all right. Colin smiled politely and answered that he simply wanted more balance in his life before graduation. His explanation sounded reasonable, yet I remembered the conversation we had shared in the laboratory about people only recognizing his achievements instead of the person carrying them. Watching him willingly step away from expectations made me wonder whether our friendship had encouraged that decision long before everything fell apart. The possibility filled me with both quiet pride and deep regret. That evening I returned to my dorm believing the distance between us had become permanent. I accepted that some relationships arrived only to teach difficult lessons rather than remain part of our lives. Just as I finished organizing notes for the following day's presentation, my phone vibrated once. The sender's name instantly stopped my breathing for a moment. Colin. I opened the message with trembling hands. Contained only one sentence. Can we meet tomorrow afternoon where this all began? The following afternoon I reached the architecture library nearly 20 minutes early, yet Colin was already there, standing beside the same long wooden table, where everything had unintentionally begun weeks before. The quiet room looked exactly as I remembered it. Students whispered over textbooks, keyboards clicked softly in the distance, and sunlight filtered through the tall windows, painting long golden lines across the polished floor. It was strange how a place could remain completely unchanged while the people inside it had become almost unrecognizable to themselves. Colin greeted me with a small smile that felt neither forced nor distant. It was simply calm. He motioned toward the empty chair across from him before placing a familiar cream-colored envelope in the center of the table. My heart skipped the moment I recognized it. It was the same envelope Brianna had asked me to deliver. For several seconds, neither of us touched it. Finally, Colin rested one hand lightly beside it and said, "I thought you should see this before we talk." I looked at the envelope more closely. The seal had never been broken. The paper remained perfectly smooth, untouched by time except for one slightly bent corner. I looked back at Colin in complete confusion. "You never opened it?" He slowly shook his head. "No." I stared at him, unable to understand. "But you thanked me. You believed it was from me." Colin gave a quiet laugh, almost embarrassed by his younger self. At first I assumed it probably was. Then, after our second conversation, I started wondering if something did not quite fit. "You looked more nervous than someone who had just confessed how they felt." The message I sent that night was meant to thank you for taking what I thought was an enormous emotional risk, not for any words inside the envelope. I had not opened it yet because I wanted to respond to you in person. He paused before continuing. "A few days later I realized something else. Whether the letter belonged to you or not had already stopped being the important part." His words settled over me with surprising gentleness. He looked around the library for a brief moment before returning his attention to me. "I kept thinking about opening it," he admitted, "but every time I reached for it, I realized I already cared much more about our conversations than whatever was written inside. I wanted to know you, not a page of handwritten sentences." My throat tightened. Every assumption I had carried since that rainy afternoon quietly began falling apart. Colin had not spent weeks building his trust around words in a letter. He had built it around shared experiences that belonged only to us. We sat in silence for several moments before he spoke again. "After you told me the truth, I needed time because I was afraid of something." I frowned slightly. "Afraid?" He nodded. "Not because you delivered someone else's letter. I understood why that happened." He folded his hands together, choosing each word carefully. "I was afraid that if I kept asking you to spend time with me immediately afterward, you would never know whether you stayed because you wanted to or because you felt guilty. I had never considered that possibility. While I spent days believing he was walking away, he had actually been protecting my freedom to decide what our friendship meant once the misunderstanding no longer existed." That realization changed everything I thought I understood about his silence. He smiled softly before continuing. "For the first time in a long while, someone treated me like an ordinary student instead of a list of achievements. I did not want that to disappear simply because both of us felt trapped by how we met." I lowered my eyes, feeling both humbled and grateful. "I thought I had already ruined everything." Colin gently shook his head. "Eli, mistakes can begin a story. They do not always have to decide how it ends." The simplicity of that sentence reached me more deeply than any dramatic declaration ever could. Outside the library windows, students crossed the courtyard beneath bright autumn trees, completely unaware that the quiet conversation unfolding inside had already changed 2 lives. Colin reached toward the unopened envelope one final time, slid it across the table until it rested directly in front of me, and smiled. Now there is only one question left. I looked up, suddenly aware that the answer would no longer be about misunderstandings, rumors, or someone else's feelings. It would be about my own. For a long moment I simply looked at the unopened envelope resting between us, realizing it had become little more than a symbol of a beginning that neither of us had chosen but both of us had lived through. I slowly pushed it back across the table toward Colin and smiled. I think it belongs to the past now. He glanced at the envelope before looking back at me. And what about everything that came after it? His question deserved an honest answer, one that no misunderstanding could hide behind anymore. I took a slow breath. The letter was never mine. The mistake was never something I wanted. But every conversation we shared, every walk across campus, every late afternoon working on our project, every cup of coffee, every time you listened when I talked about architecture or my grandfather. Those moments belonged to both of us. Nobody accidentally created those. Colin remained quiet, letting my words settle naturally instead of rushing to answer. I continued before fear could interrupt me again. Somewhere along the way, I stopped worrying about correcting a rumor because I started worrying about losing someone who had become important to me. I should have told you the truth much sooner, and I will always regret that. But I cannot pretend those weeks meant nothing, because they changed me in ways I never expected. For the first time since our conversation at the fountain, the familiar warmth returned to Colin's expression. He smiled with quiet relief rather than excitement, as though he had been carrying the same uncertainty for just as long. Then maybe we finally arrived at the same place, he said. Not because of a letter, because we both chose to keep showing up after everything became complicated. We left the library together that afternoon, not as 2 people trying to rescue an old misunderstanding, but as 2 men choosing to explore a relationship built on honesty rather than borrowed words or mistaken assumptions. A week later, Colin asked me on our first real date, one neither of us could mistake for an obligation, a rumor, or someone else's confession. I said yes. Over the following weeks, the sustainability competition reached its final presentation. The project earned recognition for combining architectural preservation with environmentally responsible engineering, but what I remembered most was not standing on the stage. It was watching Colin quietly congratulate every competing team before celebrating our own success. He no longer seemed interested in collecting titles simply because everyone expected him to. He smiled more easily, laughed more often, and even admitted he had enjoyed stepping back from several leadership positions because it finally gave him room to discover who he wanted to become instead of who everyone assumed he already was. Brianna also found her own new beginning. A few months later, one of her feature essays won a regional collegiate journalism award. She titled it "When Honesty Arrives Late." The article never mentioned names, departments, or campus rumors. Instead, it explored how fear could quietly delay the truth while honesty, even when uncomfortable, often created room for people to understand one another more deeply. Before submitting the essay, she thanked both of us for teaching her that courage sometimes arrived later than planned, but it still mattered when it finally appeared. Near the end of the spring semester, Colin invited me to walk through the campus gardens just before graduation photographs filled every corner of the university. I had accepted a graduate architecture position with a preservation firm in the same city, while Colin still had one final year of engineering ahead of him, so neither of us had to pretend that graduation meant an immediate goodbye. The trees had exchanged their autumn colors for fresh green leaves, and students were already talking about internships, graduate school, and new cities waiting beyond commencement. As we reached the small bridge overlooking the pond, Colin reached into his backpack and handed me a plain white envelope. I laughed the moment I saw it. "Should I be worried?" He laughed too. "Not this time." I opened it and found only a single blank sheet of paper with one handwritten sentence near the top. "This one belongs to you." I looked up, confused. Colin smiled gently. The first letter changed both of our lives before either of us understood what it meant. "I thought this one should stay empty until you decide what you want your next chapter to say." I folded the paper carefully and slipped it back into the envelope, realizing that sometimes the most meaningful words were not the ones already written, but the ones life patiently allowed us to discover together. Closing reflection. Perhaps the most unexpected moments in life are not always the ones that arrive perfectly planned. Sometimes they begin with ordinary misunderstandings, delayed conversations, or chances we almost let disappear because fear speaks louder than honesty. This story quietly reminds us that trust is rarely built in a single dramatic moment. More often, it grows through small acts of kindness, patient listening, and the willingness to return after difficult conversations instead of walking away forever. There are times when telling the truth feels frightening because we cannot control what happens next. Even so, honest words often create a stronger foundation than comfortable silence ever could. And sometimes the people who matter most are not the ones who entered our lives through perfect circumstances, but the ones who chose to remain after imperfections became impossible to ignore. If you found yourself in Eli's position, when would you have chosen to tell the truth? And after everything these characters experienced together, what would you have written on that final blank page if it had been placed in your hands?